Today, we're going to build a coffee table, and it's going to be round, and it's going to look like this. And yes, I drew those myself, and my kids made fun of me and said it looked like a spaceship, but it's the best that I can do. And this is our current coffee table. So whatever we end up with, it's going to be better than that. All right, let's get building.
And the wood we're going to use for this project is sapele. It's an exotic wood similar to African mahogany. And you may have heard it pronounced different ways before. Some people say sapele, some people say sapele, or sapele, or sepele. Actually, nobody says sepele, but whatever you call it, it doesn't matter. I mean, wasn't it Shakespeare who said, "What's in a name? That which we call sapele by any other name would smell as sweet." And coincidentally, sapele does have a nice aroma when you cut it. It's similar to cedar in that regard. But you still want to make sure you're wearing your respirator when working with it. And these boards are a little bit wider than my joiner, but as you can see here, they are pretty straight. So rather than cutting them down to fit at my joiner or building some kind of planing sled, I'm just going to try skip planing them. And if you're unfamiliar with what skip planing is, it's just sending the boards through the planer, alternating the face side with each pass, in an attempt to get the boards as straight as possible. Now, I wouldn't recommend this method for boards with a big cup or bow or twist in them, but these boards are pretty straight, and honestly, for this project, it'll work well enough. So after taking care of both faces, it's time to address the edges, and for that, I'm moving over to the joiner. And if I didn't have a joiner, I'd probably use the track saw or a straight line ripping jig at the table saw. And when edge joining at the joiner, I'm making sure I reference my fence, because that's what's going to give me the square cut I'm looking for, provided my fence is square with the bed. And a little joiner tip: when you're face joining a board, you often use the entire bed and blade area. But that's not necessarily the case with edge joining, so from time to time you want to make sure that you move the fence so that you can give each part of the blade just as much abuse as the other parts. And when you move the fence, make sure you check for square again. Doing this will help prolong the life of your blades by making sure that they wear evenly. It'll also help with the performance of your joiner by making sure that your blades don't have high and low spots. And after getting that first jointed edge done, I take the boards over to the table saw and put that newly minted jointed edge up against the fence so that I can get the other side parallel. And this is probably my favorite cut to make because it means that now I've officially taken a board from rough to square. Or at least square enough. You know, since I didn't really joint the faces, I just skip planed them. But it'll work, don't worry, it's square enough. It'll work. It'll work. All right, with day one in the books, we just let these boards rest now and come back tomorrow for the glue ups. So I've got to glue up the 3 legs and the tabletop today. And between the 3 legs and the tabletop, the legs are going to be a little bit easier. So we'll start with those. And the one thing that you want to remember, which I actually didn't remember for my glue ups, is that you don't want to over tighten the clamps, because that can result in a less than flat panel. So my panels weren't 100% flat, but we're just going to keep it moving. So don't beat yourself up if you make a mistake. I mean, if you could fix it, great, but depending on the mistake, a lot of times it doesn't even matter. So for the tabletop, I'm going to put some dominoes in for alignment purposes, but I'm not being too particular on where I put the dominoes. I just don't want to put them where I'm going to be cutting the circle out. And another reason I'm not being too precise with my markings is because I'm going to be plunging one mortise on the tight setting and the mating mortise on the loose setting. And that's just to make the joining of the boards together easier during the glue up. And easier is definitely something I could have used more of during this glue up odyssey. So it's the next day now, and I took the panels out of the clamps, and I went over everything with some 80 grit sandpaper just to clean up the glue squeeze out and level out any seams that might have needed it. So now I'm cutting out the circle tabletop. Now my preferred method for doing this is to actually use a template, but I didn't feel like cutting out a 3-foot diameter circle just for this project and to never use it again. So I'm just cutting out the tabletop directly. And I'm using a spiral upcut bit to route out the channel, which will help with chip evacuation, thus reducing heat buildup and prolonging the life of the bit. And to do this, I just make one pass, clean out the chips, lower the router, and make another pass. And I made a total of 4 passes before moving on to the jigsaw. Now, I would have loved to have cut this tabletop out at the bandsaw, but it was just too big and cumbersome. As a general rule of thumb, if a piece is really small, you can bring the piece to the tool. But if it's really big, you find a way to bring the tool to the piece. And using a jigsaw here is actually really cumbersome because you have to stay in the channel with the jigsaw while also, not cutting into the tabletop. Which unfortunately I have done before. You can check out my dining room table video if you want to see that. And this is what I'm left with after my first pass. And like I said, I didn't want to cut into my tabletop again, so I left a little bit more on the outside than I can actually get away with. See, these little knobs right here have to go, because when I flush trim, the router runs along this edge here, and they would run into them. So I've got to get rid of them. But I would take care of that off camera, so let's just move to the flush trimming. Now, confession time. I really like flush trimming, and this flush trim bit just makes it all that much more better. That doesn't sound right. That can't be proper grammar, right? I don't know. Let's just move on. Whatever. Now, the reason I really like this bit, especially for this particular task, is that when you're routing around the perimeter of a circle, most of it is going to be end grain. And so having a large diameter compression bit like this, it results in a smoother cut, less chance for tear out, and less chance for kickback. And as you can see, I'm going pretty slow, but like I said, this is end grain, and you have to go slow around the end grain. And you definitely want to be wearing your safety gear when doing this, because I don't know if you notice, but there's a haze in my shop now. So I know that you can see all the big dust it leaves, but it also creates a lot of fine dust. So that was a lot of fun. And now I've got my tabletop cut out. So I guess the next step is to clean up all of this mess. Then I think I'm going to let my air filtration run while I go eat some lunch. Then I'll come back to work on the legs. All right, the shop is a little bit less messy and the air is a little bit more clean. So the last thing that we're going to do for the day is to size up these legs. So I'm making this first cut with my track saw, and it probably would be faster with a crosscut sled at the table saw, but I only currently have a crosscut sled for my job site saw. I don't have one for my cabinet saw yet, and I didn't want to break that thing out just to make these cuts. So here we are, using the track saw. And this is just another example of how in woodworking you can use multiple tools to do the same job, because this worked great. I just need to confirm that it's square, and then we can make the move over to the table saw. So I'm just taking that edge that I cut with the track saw and putting it up against the fence. And this cut that I'm making now will determine the height of the table legs. Now I have my 50-tooth blade in here, and that little bit of fraying that you see as I make the cut could be reduced if I went a little bit slower, but this is fine. It's not going to make a difference. So the base of this table is going to be comprised of 3 legs that join together in the middle. And I'm going to do that by a long grain to long grain glue connection, which will be super strong. I just need to figure out what angle I need to cut to get them to join together. And as math would have it, that angle that I need to cut is 60 degrees. And the best way I know to set my saw blade to those odd degrees is with one of these digital magnetic angle finders. They probably all work similarly, but I'll leave a link to this one below, as well as some other tools I use during this build. Now these panels are currently longer than they need to be, but in my view, it's easier to cut the angles first and then cut them down to size. Also of note, I forgot to lower the saw blade after I set the angle, but this blade should not have been that high. So what you do next is just flip the board over, leaving the fence in the same spot that it was, and just make the cut again. And what you'll be left with is a perfectly centered point with a 60-degree cut on either side. And I have one more cut to make before I can be done for the day, but for now I've got to take some kids to practice, so I'm going to have to come back and make that cut later on tonight. Okay, it's now later on tonight. Soccer and volleyball practice went great, so now I have one more cut to make before I can retire for the evening. And this cut's pretty straightforward. I just put the pointed side against the fence and rip these legs down to their final length. With that cut, these legs have officially been sized, and I have one more cut to make on them tomorrow, and then the base glue up. So that one additional cut that I mentioned that I wanted to make on the legs is to add what we'll call a taper on there. And I settled on 15 degrees, and I just used my miter saw and T-bevel to lock in that angle. From there, it's just as simple as transferring it over to the actual workpiece. First, I strike a line with the T-bevel. Then I extend that line with the straight edge. Then I line up both ends of the line with the edge of this plywood. And for this plywood, I cut a fresh edge at the table saw using the position of the fence where it is now. And then I don't move the fence again. So now the edge of this plywood is flush with the saw blade. And once I have the leg in place, I have some double-sided tape on these offcuts to lock in the position of the leg. And since each leg is the same exact size, this will just ensure that I make the same cut on all 3 legs. And once I have those blocks secured, I give it a little test drive before making the cut. Then I just proceed to make the cut. But once I do make the cut, I'm not going to get rid of that offcut just yet. And when I thought about putting dominoes in, I wasn't quite sure if I'd be able to fit the 3 legs together once the dominoes were in there. But I went ahead and plunged the mortises anyway. And it turned out I was right. With dominoes in all 3 legs, there's no way I could put these together. So even though I plunged mortises in all 3 legs, I was only able to put dominoes in one of them. And as for why I saved the offcuts, I'm reattaching them to the legs with double-sided tape so they can work as clamping blocks.
Because of the angled legs, if I didn't have these clamping blocks, the clamps would just slide off once I tightened them. All right, the sun's going down and my wife's taking the kids to a trunk or treat, and I'm getting ready for the final glue up. I feel more prepared for this glue up, and yes, I'm using the same glue bottle that I used for the last glue up, but I don't have to cover as much ground, so it should be all right. And I'm doing the glue up on my table saw because it's flatter than my workbench. Oh, and a tip when you're doing glue ups, always do a dry fit. Because when I did the dry fit earlier, because I have these cutoffs taped back on the legs, it's hard to tell the orientation of the leg just by looking at them. And I actually had one of my legs on upside down, which prompted me to write this on the top of the legs. Needless to say, that would have been disastrous if I would have glued up one of these legs upside down. For glue ups like these, I find that ratchet straps work best for clamps, and I got these from Home Depot. They were like $10 for a pack of 4, and they work great. And the glue up was pretty chill, actually. You know, I had to use the persuader a little bit, but nothing too crazy. And it's looking pretty good. I am going to take it off the table saw, but other than that, we're good till tomorrow. Okay, so the next day we take it out of the straps, remove the clamping blocks, and remove some glue squeeze out, and we're looking pretty good. But you'll see a little bit of a gap here, but listen, I'm just a dude in my garage having fun. This is well within my tolerable limits. Plus, as a reminder, and to clean the glue squeeze up out of the corner, I just took one of these plastic spreaders and a 5-inch sanding disc and did this. Now the only design detail left is how I'm going to treat the edge profiles of both the base and the top. The base is going to get a fingernail profile, and what that looks like is that the edge of the leg will be completely round, but there will be a sharp distinctive line where the round part meets the straight part. And this is done by using a roundover bit with a radius that's larger than half the thickness of the workpiece. And these legs are 1 1/4 inches thick, and half of that would be 5/8. So I'm using a 3/4 inch roundover bit. So then you just position the router bit to a depth so that the bottom of the cutter is in the middle of the workpiece. And that'll produce a round profile with a sharp edge like you see here. Then you just flip the piece over and do it again. And you're left with a rounded edge, but with a sharp distinctive line separating the rounded part from the straight. And if you have your bit just a little bit too far down, like I did here, just clean it up with hand sanding. And for the tabletop, I'm putting a 1/8 inch roundover on both the bottom side and the top side. After sanding everything to 180 grit, raising the grain with water, and then sanding again, now I'm ready for the finish. And for the finish, I'm using something that I've never used before, and that's Natura One Coat. It's a 2-part hard wax oil similar to Rubio Monocoat, and spoiler alert, it looks great. And double spoiler alert, despite the name, it is not a one-coat finish. This stuff looks like Rubio, it even smells like Rubio. And despite both their names, neither one of them is a one-coat finish. They both look dramatically better with the second coat. So if you like Rubio, you should definitely give this a try, especially considering how much less it costs than Rubio. Oh, and as far as applying that second coat, I just wait a day, then go over the first coat with a maroon pad or 400 grit sandpaper, then wipe off the dust, then just apply that second coat. Look at that. Looks like a beautiful wooden planet. We're going to have this table on a rug, but just in case it lives any of its life on a hardwood floor, I chamfer the edges of the base and install these retractable leveling feet. And to account for wood movement, I use figure 8 fasteners to attach the top. 3 fasteners probably would have been fine, but I went with 6 just in case, since I drilled into the end grain. And with that, our spaceship table is done.
As usual, it was a lot of fun to build and to make the video, so I hope you guys enjoyed it. All right, we'll see you guys in the next one. Y'all take it easy.